I'm here to talk about, this is an uncomfortable talk, about the solution for a polluted river in Chennai, which was so unjust. Yeah. For those who are familiar with Chennai, the two major rivers are the Adyar and the Cooum rivers, right? And so this was based on some work we did in 2017 and 18, funded by the Azim Premji University, an environmental justice project. So when Subhadra asked me to talk about this particular work of mine, because I'm associated with the Biodiversity and Conservation Center, right? I said, why do you want me to talk about this? Now I know why you want me to talk about this, to bring about some diversity, talk about uncomfortable things, right? So let me just quickly set the conceptual background, and also run through, project some geospatial and water quality information, which sets kind of the social and environmental context for a human interest story, right? So environmental justice is a field of activism and scholarship, yeah? And first established in the US in the 1970s. And there's been, of course, environmental justice is implicit in all environmental struggles in India, but in the US it's kind of approached a little differently. It looks at disproportionate impacts of pollution and degradation on racialized minorities, right? So it is an emergent field of research in India. Amitabh Bhaviska's work in 2006, Forging Environmentalism. Also, Mukul Sharma's very important work in 2012 about why Dalits as a category lie hidden in terms like communities, vulnerable, marginal, ecological refugees, etc., right? So his was a critique of the valorization and romanticization of tradition and customs, including those of forest dwellers and peasants, customs and traditions, which were in the first place responsible for making Dalits untouchable. And then more directly kind of related to my work is Karen Coelho's work, the anthropologist from Chennai. And she's been kind of following and critiquing this whole big 1,000 crore project of Singara Chennai. Singara in Tamil means beautiful, okay, beautifying Chennai, right? So it kind of will involve the resettlement of 18,000 families at least, and who middle classes blame for the state of the water, right? So it's got waterfront development, beautification, eco-restoration, right? And along with high-end infrastructure. And she says it serves as direct strategies for capital accumulation by increasing real estate value, but also kind of putting Chennai in the league of big cities. But environmental justice is a vibrant field of activism in India. Bhopal, tragedy, and the activism after that. More closely, the work of Nityanand Jairam in Chennai on the mercury contamination in Kodaikanal and its implication on health, etc., right? And so we look at environmental justice as a policy, right? It basically looks at the equal treatment, okay, procedural justice, equal treatment and involvement in the development and kind of enforcement of all environmental policies involving all communities. So fundamentally, what environmental justice, I'm going to revisit this at the end of my talk, right? Environmental justice, it redefined environment from just wilderness to any place where you and me live, work, and play. That is the environment, right? That was the redefinition. And so, so looking at the caste and class profiles, we kind of surveyed about 300 riverside settlements, yeah? And it's no surprise that environmentally marginalized spaces are habitats for humans marginalized by religion and its hierarchical tendencies. And also the majority of river residents' families did not have patta, tenure, right? And they live in titleless houses as owners or as tenants, right? Or they live in housing board colonies. And if you look at the occupational profile, they are like working classes, right? And the livelihood income of riverside settlements is predominantly from daily labor, while men carry loads, for private businesses and the government. Women work as domestic labor, right? And riverside dwellers are a precariat, right? Men can't find manual work every day, and in the last decade, they need to compete for work with North Indian migrants. And So there's waterborne disease, there's vector-borne disease, right? And there's a kind of a no disease category there. It does not mean that there's a lack of pollution of proximate waters or absence of disease. It just means that respondents may simply be responding in ways that kind of discount regular gastro, dermatological, and neural conditions, right? And the regular category corresponds to high pollution spots that are marked in red. So across all kind of categories, BOD, COD, fecal coliform, right? The pollution was high in both Cooum and Adyar, right? And the pollution exceeded sewage retreatment standards. And this poses health and risks to both Dalit and other working classes, residing in the riverbanks. Yeah. So just kind of quickly recapping, 20% from our work, 20% of riverside settlements were exclusively Dalit settlements. Inhabitants were a working class precariat, uncertain, their lives are uncertain. 45% of the houses had no pata or title. And all parameters, especially in Cooum, showed increased values around certain areas, and Adyar also in certain areas. But today the talk is about, the human interest story is about one particular village, Satyavani Muthunagar, which along the Coom's banks, right? So there's also political context, right, that forces some socio-psychological conditions. The legal threat of eviction, right, because they are illegal encroachers, so that weighs in their mind. There's so much of uncertainty, right? There's also politicians' promises. They're a vote bank, but nothing gets done, right? They don't have their own councillors. They don't have local government, right? So there's a lot of frustration with electoral representatives. And there's always this big gentrification project of Singara Chennai, right? So there's a lot of righteous indignation among people, right? What about us, right? You don't want us in Chennai, right? We labored for you. Now you want us out of the picture, right? Where do we go? Are we not humans, right? We'll come to that. So what does it really mean? Right, so all of us might be wondering, why do people have to live in such polluted waters, right? And they are responsible for this pollution. So I'm just here to narrate the rest of my time briefly for what it means for Dalit and other working class citizens of Satyavani Muthunagar, a marginal settlement, right? I'm saying marginal settlement, I'm saying riverside settlement, because I don't want to use the pejorative word of slum, right? What it means to live in environmentally degraded spaces or circumstances. Right. So it's all about placemaking. So there's a big debate in America, if people moved into polluted spaces or their spaces were polluted, right? But here it appears that people moved into polluted spaces, right? So when people moved here in the 1970s and 80s, the place was apparently used by the army, which had a camp nearby, as a dumping site, okay? And people refer to this part of Coom's banks as Kuppamedu or garbage slopes, okay, and Pottalkadu or scrub land, right? And people made this place inhabitable. The water was polluted, right? But they needed a place, right? And kind of settlement location, where they choose to settle, is a function of their class location, right? So when asked why riverside dwellers typically happen to be Dalits, informants of Satyavani Nagar attribute their class identities as poor wage laborers who cannot afford high rents as reason for their settlement in a marginal space. Of course, as environmental justice scholars, we need to be sensitive to intersectionalities between caste, class, and gender identities. They cannot play into each other, right? And so Dalit migrants are typically landless and oppressed rural folk who seek working class existence and subsistence in cities. And why do people kind of live amidst biophysically and politico-legally stressful circumstance? To recap again, biophysical because it's polluted waters, right? This fecal coliform, this heavy metal, the vector-borne disease, this waterborne disease, right? And why it's a biophysically stressful circumstance, but also politico-legally stressful because, there are, frequent fires which break out, which people say is to make them kind of, move out. There is the threat of eviction. There is this threat of this whole gentrification project of Singara Chennai, right, for middle classes and rich people. So it's a matter of, I think, choiceless inhabitation. Now, choosing this polluted space to move into and continue to dwell in is ironically choiceless. What informants told has very interesting human development implications, and we know human development approach is a policy parlance for Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, right? So Sen identifies capabilities as a space for comparing, life quality assessments. And actually our informants compared themselves to the lives of middle class people and said, and they told us, this is how we live, right? And so the assessment is fundamentally about what each person is able to do and be, right? Function, human functioning, the freedoms to function, right? So the impetus is on freedom and choice. Now, our Dalit informants speak about choices the rich have. They can do different businesses. They can do what they want. Okay, they have choice and opportunity. They can be cinema actors, right? Right, and but the Dalits can only be porters. They can only be coolies. They can only be electricians or auto drivers, right? And so this whole Singara Chennai scheme creates more choices and opportunities for Chennai's rich and middle classes, and reduces opportunities for river residents who stare at the horrors of being relocated to the peripheries. There's also kind of why they choose to stay there is locational advantages, right? So speaking of which, the people here, Satyavani Muthunagar, for those of you who are familiar with Chennai, is near Chennai Central, near the Central Railway Station, right? And it offers two proximate advantages for the poor, two important life resources. One is work, the other is the hospital. Yeah. So if resettled in the city's peripheries, they will have to travel to the city, right? And this involves time, which is money, and money itself. And the government hospital and the medical college hospital nearby ensures health services that are readily and cheaply accessible. But there's a bit of an absurd and unjust irony here. Now, people know pollution sources and causes. When we went, they even showed us the source points, right? And they talk about private small businesses, shops letting out, their the grey waters, but also public sector sources like the Central Railway Station and the government hospital. Now, here is the irony. The government and medical college hospitals are both a source of pollution, yeah, and places for treatment of diseases due to pollution they also contribute to, right? Now, there's also another reason, so resettlement to the peripheries, right, 25, 26 kilometers away, they are risky spaces too. Someone earlier in the morning spoke about, these marshy lands in Chennai, right, where people were resettled, right? So, for example, there was a recent film, I don't know, those of you who watch Tamil films, it was called Jail. It was made by a pretty good director called Vasant Balan. Now, it flopped critically and commercially, despite it being based on a very interesting social and a sociological place called Kannagi Nagar in Thoraipakkam, 24 kilometers from Chennai. It was a housing board complex which was built there in the low-lying areas between 2000 and 2010 to resettle riverside residents from the cities as part of the Singara Chennai scheme. So livelihood opportunities were lost, men took to alcohol and drugs, they turned to crime, right? And so Satyavani's residents dread having to move to a crime-infested periphery with no fiscal or physical security, right? And if you're from Kannagi Nagar, nobody will employ you because it has kind of been labeled as a criminal hotspot. And those of you who have read literature on American Indians, right, in their colonies, right, why they take to drugs and alcohol, right, you'll understand why this happened to the people of Kannagi Nagar. And again, so the people do realize that Singara Chennai is a clear kind of a gentrification scheme, right? They say once they go, multiplexes and IT offices and apartments will come up and they'll be resettled, right? So kind of to concluding, right? So the picture there, so the evictions started in Satyavani Muthunagar, right? And about 1,000 families have been resettled in Perumbakkam at about 27 kilometers away. 3,000 families still precariously reside in the river's banks, and 120 families have been resettled in Puliandop, which is just 2 kilometers from here. Now that is what I call dignified resettlement, thanks to the efforts of the Communist Party and the dynamic young leader called Selva, right? So the picture to the right, it's like a new, decent, dignified complex in the heart of the city, right? So people don't want to move because, again, the centrality of location advantage is you find jobs, right, very nearby, right? You can go for the work in the morning, get work and come back home in the evening. Suppose you are resettled to the peripheries, you don't find jobs there. You have to travel for 50 kilometers every day to find jobs, right? So all they are asking is for a dignified resettlement in housing board colonies in these riverside spaces. The rest of the space you take and you gentrify and do what you want. That's what they're asking for, right? So, just to conclude, this whole Singara Chennai scheme or any other similar scheme in India or any other third world country, there is efforts to restore rivers, right? And restoration is based on this very American concept of pristinity, right? You want to restore a forest to pristine conditions. You want to restore water to pristine conditions, right? But if you look at the environmental justice definition of environment, which is any place where one lives, stays, and plays, what the Singara Chennai scheme and Chennai's leaders, both the parties, DMK and ADMK, and other conservation NGOs are doing there is a perverse co-optation and inversion of the environmental justice definition of environment, right? So as long as poor, ugly, dark, low-caste people live there, the environmental justice definition will not work. But once they move off, they will restore the river cleanly and have posh apartments there. So for them, the environmental justice definition kicks in, which is any place where middle classes live, play, and work. It's got to be clean, right? Thank you.